was introduced to an idea several years ago by a colleague of mine named Esther. We worked together at a church in Texas, just one of the saints of the church. Before she came to work in the church, she worked at a food bank in the town that we were living in, and she brought this concept of food insecurity. And at that point, at least for me, that was a new term. It may be new, it may be old for you, but food insecurity was the notion that there's a large number of people, not just in foreign countries, but in our own country, in our own communities, there's a large portion of people who don't know where their next meal will come from or if there will be a next meal. They are food insecure. They're not secure in their capacity to eat. And she talked a lot about the profound impact that had on their daily living. And as we talked about the church, as we talked about what it meant to be the church, that conversation about food insecurity kind of transitioned into a broader notion of love insecurity. And love insecurity just kind of sounded a little bit weird, and so we kept kind of working with that to try to capture this notion that there is a large number of people who not only are food insecure, but they are insecure about love. In other words, they don't know when or if they will be loved next. They don't know when or if they will be wanted. They don't know when or if they will have a home. And so we eventually made our way around, instead of love insecure, to love starved, because I love the notion. I think this is something that every one of us can connect to at least a little bit, if not a lot. That all of us know what it's like to be hungry for more love. We all know that kind of feeling. We're not talking about a kind of a touchy-feely need to be popular or need to be liked. We're talking about one of the most deep-seated human needs, that deep-seated human longing to belong that asks the question, do I belong? Do I have a home? Am I wanted? Right? When you pull back and think about this culturally, I think this is really challenging, because those institutions and venues to which we used to turn in order to belong, those things are fraying and eroding, right? Communally, culturally, we aren't able to turn to the same kinds of resources that we used to be able to know that, okay, these are my people. And the same is true, by the way, in the church even, right? As we think about our church subculture, too many of us in the church have bought into this vision of Jesus, this notion of God that is thoroughly transactional. We've talked about this a little bit before, but we buy into this notion of God that if we don't perform well enough, then God won't love us. The problem is we can't perform well enough. We know we can't perform well enough, and even if we could perform well enough, God is this cranky old guy who's really just hiding behind the couch waiting to catch us in sin and delights in our suffering. And so there's no hope for us who are love-starved, either culturally or in the church. If you bring it more personal, some of us live in families who love us so well that we rarely have to wonder whether or not we are loved. Rarely, but not never. Right? I don't believe there is a human on earth who doesn't know what it's like to hunger for more love. This is why we spend so much time chasing status or chasing particular relationships or chasing particular professions or chasing a particular financial state. We do that because we long to belong. But some of us live in families who meet that need for us most of the time. And conversely, there's a good portion of us who live with families or toxic relationships that represent a constant assault on our ability to know whether or not we're loved. We are constantly asking for most of our life whether or not we are worthy of love. So where is it that we are supposed to turn? Where do the love-starved among us turn to find that sense of security? To find that sense that we are loved unconditionally, to find that sense that beyond a shadow of a doubt, regardless of my performance in life as a human, I'm going to be loved. I'm going to give you the most churchy answer ever. Obviously, for those of us who follow Jesus, obviously, the answer is Christ. Right? He shows us this time and time again. Sometimes he shows us by telling us, sometimes he shows us with his actions, but he shows us time and time again that he is the only one that can fully satisfy that deep hunger for more love. And the stories that we've been chasing the last couple of weeks, as we've followed Jesus around northern Israel and beyond, the stories we've been chasing the last couple of weeks have been showing us exactly who Jesus is, exactly what God wants for us. And I want to end on a story that I think is a profound example of how God thinks about you and how God thinks about me. But we will miss it if we don't read it so carefully, because it's one of those stories that we've heard it before. It's one of those stories that a little bit too often we see it, we've got it, we move on. We see it, we've got it, we move on. So we're going to slow it down like we do occasionally, or maybe a little bit more than occasionally. We're going to slow that down and take a good, hard look at what unfolds in Mark chapter 8. But I want to remind you of where we've been on this journey the last couple of weeks. If you haven't been with us the last couple of weeks, welcome back. We're glad you're here. I hope you'll take a chance, take the opportunity to go watch some of the last couple of messages, because you'll hear a lot of this today. But I want to show you where we've been the last couple of weeks. We've got the map up on the screen to remind us of the journey that we've been on. 3 weeks ago, we started up in northern Israel near the Sea of Galilee. And you can see it up there. It's something called the Evangelical Triangle, where most of Jesus' ministry takes place. But we heard in the first week how he's crossing the Sea of Galilee. He's fighting against this storm and he's pushing against it. There is no power on earth that can keep Jesus from the direction in which he is determined to go. And that direction is to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. 2 weeks ago, we landed in Gergesa. Jesus encountered an absolutely, completely, utterly broken human and brings him in, heals him, and sends him out. After that, we left the Sea of Galilee and we traveled outside of the boundaries of Israel, right? Jesus leaves Israel because there's no boundary that contains the love of God. There is no boundary he's unwilling to cross. And so we saw that Jesus goes to the northwest, to the Mediterranean Sea, to a place called Tyre. Now, I want to take a moment. We've got Tyre on the map too. I want to take a moment because I got a few messages last week about how I was saying the word Tyre. Do we have that map up there? I think we've got it. Let's go see Tyre. I got a few messages about how I was saying that word Tyre. And now a bunch of people said I Googled it. It's called Tyre. And I just feel like something in the Bible shouldn't be called Tyre. So I'm going to stick with Tyre, even if I'm saying it wrong, so that perhaps you'll remember the story of Tyre. And remember that Jesus crosses every boundary, even going to a place like Tyre, where he encounters a lost and broken woman and her daughter and heals them and brings them home. Right? That's the story that we hear last week. And this week, we're going to return to a previous scene of the crime, so to speak. We're going to go back to the Sea of Galilee. We're going to go back to the other side. We're going to go back to the place called Decapolis that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Decapolis, remember, is a Roman place, not a Jewish place. It's a Roman place. This is where people live who are dedicated to everything that is not God's law. These are people who don't worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These are people who reject everything about what we know as the Old Testament. These are people who, even when Jesus healed this man who's lived among them as a possessed man, when Jesus healed that man, these are people who begged Jesus to leave. And Jesus did. And now Jesus comes back. And even if we didn't say another word about what happens next, part of what we can hear is that even when we beg Jesus to leave, Jesus keeps coming back over and over and over again. He will never just leave. He will always come back because he wants the people who live in the Decapolis. And this time, we're going to land in a place called Hippos, or in a city, or in a location near a city called Hippos, which is a pretty significant city there in the Decapolis. And we're going to start at the beginning of Mark chapter 8. But right at the end of Mark 7, what we hear is that when Jesus comes back, there is suddenly this large crowd of people who are interested in what Jesus is doing and what Jesus is saying. And I just want to point out the difference between the last time Jesus was there and this time that Jesus is there. The last time they begged him to leave, this time there are crowds. How do we account for the large crowd that shows up? Who cares to hear what Jesus is teaching? Who cares to see what Jesus is doing? I think we can account for that by the end of the story that we looked at 2 weeks ago. Remember this man who's possessed that Jesus heals? At the end of that story, Mark records that he asked Jesus, "Hey, Jesus, can I get in the boat with you and go back to the good side?" Can I go back to the other side, the good side of the sea of God? Can I go live with you, Jesus? And we fully expect Jesus to say, absolutely, come on home with me. And we're a little surprised to hear Jesus say, nope. You go home, you go back to your family, you go back to your friends, and you tell them. Tell them what the Lord has done for you. Well, now just a couple of chapters and a few days or weeks later, suddenly there's a large crowd. How do we account for that? Because that guy told them. Because that guy went around this region that doesn't care about God, around this region that is committed to every kind of behavior that God doesn't want for us, this region that is committed to violence and greed. That guy went to that place and told them what God had done. And now suddenly folks are showing up, not to hear the broken man's story again. Now suddenly the people are showing up to hear straight from Jesus. That's where our story picks up in Mark chapter 8 and verse 1. If you have your Bible, I'd encourage you to take it out, follow it on your phone. We're going to be in the first 9 verses of Mark 8. In those days when there was again a great crowd without anything to eat. Even in the first verse, we've got to pause and say just a brief word. Again, there's a big crowd with nothing to eat. If we were reading straight through Mark's gospel, what we would have encountered in Mark chapter 6 is a story that begins, there was a great crowd with nothing to eat in a remote hillside area. And Jesus saw that they were hungry, collected the small amount of bread that they had, multiplied it, gave it to the people, and everybody was fed. And there was leftovers even. We sometimes call that story the feeding of the 5,000. That was just in Mark 6. Here at the beginning of Mark 8, even Mark is saying, hey, here we go again. And we're tempted to say, but why this story? We don't hear a whole lot of repeat stories. There must be a reason why Mark is capturing this story again. It's not just because Jesus did it again, but there was something different about this story than the first time Jesus did it. And we've got to keep an eye on what the difference is, because what I'm going to suggest later is the difference between the story that we're going to hear, which is the same story, and the story that we heard in chapter 6 is going to make a world of difference for you and for me and for how we show up in this world. So again, we have a great crowd without anything to eat. So Jesus called his disciples and said to them, one of the things that we want to watch are the disciples picking it up. Right? One of the things that we've tracked over the last couple of weeks is time and again, we hear the disciples are like 100 yards behind Jesus, still trying to figure out what in the world are you doing? Surely by now, after all of these stories that we've looked at for the last couple of weeks, surely this time the disciples are finally going to be on the same page as Jesus. Will they catch up? Listen to what Jesus says. He called his disciples and said to them, I have compassion for the crowd. It's a weirdly formal way to say this, right? It sounds just very wooden. I want to carry the sense of what Jesus is saying. Right? When he says, I have compassion for the crowd, that word compassion is something that grows out of the gut. This isn't Jesus like very stiffly and woodenly saying, I have compassion for the crowd, right? He's saying, guys, these people are hurting. Like I feel for them. Maybe that's a better way to say what Jesus is saying. Oh, probably I don't want to correct Jesus. But for us to understand what Jesus is saying, let's say it that way, I feel for this crowd. I have compassion for the crowd because they've been with me now for 3 days and they have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they'll faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance. And again, just think about what that means. Not only do we have a large crowd, we have a large crowd from the other side who have traveled a great distance and are so enthralled by what Jesus has to say that they're risking starvation for it, right? They are so captured by what Jesus has to say that they no longer care for their physical sustenance. That's a remarkable kind of attraction. It's one of these things that we point out from time to time, right? When Jesus encounters, or when people from the other side encounter Jesus, what they don't find is somebody keeping them at arm's length. What they don't find is somebody who is rushing to tell them they're going to hell. What they don't find is somebody keeping them at a 10-foot pole's length. What they find instead is something so attractive, something that draws them in so powerfully that they're willing to travel great distances, they're willing to stay a long time, that they're willing to risk starvation or at least deep hunger just to hear what Jesus has to say. I wonder, friends, if that's how folks outside the church see the followers of Jesus. I wonder if they see in us something attractive and compelling, or if they see something that is at arm's length, holding them back because they're not one of us. For Jesus, he's very clear over and over again. He's always drawing the other side into him. His disciples replied, well, how can we feed these people with bread here in the desert? And you just want to slap them. You just want to slap them. Are you kidding me? You just saw this. It was in chapter 6. That was 2 chapters ago. You saw more people fed with less food. What do you mean, how are we going to feed them here in the desert? You have Jesus. And it makes me think, perhaps the question here is not that the disciples don't understand that Jesus could do that again. Perhaps the disconnect is that the disciples aren't sure whether they want Jesus to do that again. And why would that be a question for them? Let's hang on and find out in a minute. The disciples replied, how can one feed these people with bread here in the desert? And Jesus asked them, and he takes a big, long sigh. I'm pretty sure he takes a big, long sigh. Okay, here we go again. How many loaves do you have? Okay, we've been here before. How many loaves do you have? And they said 7. And then he ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground. He took the 7 loaves, and after giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples to distribute. And they distributed them to the crowd. And they also had a few small fish. And after blessing the fish, Jesus ordered that these too should be distributed. And they ate and were filled, and they took up the broken pieces left over, and there were 7 baskets full. And Mark adds on to the end, almost as an aside, I think he buried the lead. By the way, he says, there were about 4,000 people there. By the way, there's about 4,000 people there. What we hear in Jesus' direction is so profound for us. I have to make sure that you hear it. It's a couple things. One, where are the eyes of the disciples versus the eyes of Jesus? The eyes of the disciples, I think, must be. Remember, they're on the Sea of Galilee. They're on the wrong side of the Sea of Galilee, right? They're on the right side. I think the eyes of the disciples are on the northwest side. I think they're looking for how they can get home the fastest. Jesus, they're hungry. Can we just send them away so we can go home? Notice the difference between where the disciples' eyes are and where Jesus' eyes are. Jesus is looking squarely at the people in front of him, not because of where they are from, not because of how they are behaving, but because he can see a need right in front of him. And Jesus' answer is to collect from the community whatever resources they have. And he takes the bread and the fish, he gives thanks over it, and multiplies it. And I don't think there's any way around seeing this as a physical miracle. That somehow with 7 loaves and a few fish, Jesus manages to feed 4,000 people. This is a miraculous provision of God. It's a provision of sustenance that's carried out right before their eyes. I don't think there's any way around this being a physical miracle. If we can believe, which I think we do, that Jesus is the Son of God and was raised from the dead, then multiplying some loaves and fishes is not a big leap. I think this is a physical miracle. And yet, I'm pretty convinced that's not even the most important part of what we just heard. Because after Jesus takes the bread, breaks it, gives thanks to God for the bread, after he does all that, what does he do? He gives it to the disciples to distribute. Right? Jesus sees the need, provides the solution, and then sends the disciples to deliver it. Friends, there isn't a plainer vision of what the church is. There is not a more obvious image of what it means for us to be a church than what we just heard. That God is daily providing for us, daily providing healing and forgiveness and love and grace. He is daily seeing the need in front of us, providing for us, and asking us to distribute exactly what we have received from God Himself. That is the gospel. It is what it means to be a Christian community, the body of Christ, the church. That's it. Now, we get through that whole story and realize, yep, it is the same story that we heard in Mark 6. So why did we retell it? Why wasn't the first time enough? Well, maybe Mark was confused. This is the question that we ask sometimes. Maybe Mark was confused, and he accidentally included a second story. But he really was talking about the first story and forgot? That doesn't make any sense. I mean, that doesn't pass the sniff test. That doesn't smell right. There's a reason that Mark includes this story, and I want to suggest that the reason is already in front of you. Because the feeding of the 5,000 takes place on the right side of the tracks. The feeding of the 5,000, go back and read it in Mark 6, it takes place on the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee. And there are 12 baskets left over in that story. Why might there be 12 baskets left over for Israel? Because there are 12 tribes in Israel. And part of what Jesus is showing the disciples and the Jewish folks on that side of the Sea of Galilee, part of what He's showing them is there is more than enough for all of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There are more than enough for the 12 tribes of Israel. God's provision is abundant, and it is for you. But the story that we just heard, the feeding of the 4,000, takes place on the other side. Jesus went over there, I believe, very specifically to do the same miracle, provide the same sustenance, provide the same antidote to a love-starved world, showing them that there is no boundary, showing that there's no container that can hold God's love in, breaking every barrier to feed the entire world. In fact, you can look again to the number 7 baskets. When Israel was taking possession of the promised land, way back in the Old Testament, when Israel's taking possession of the promised land, there are 7 countries or 7 tribes that lived in the promised land that Israel had to displace in order to take possession of the land that God had promised them. And that number 7, those 7 tribes, those 7 people, that became representative for the tribes of the world. It became representative for the nations of the world. That number 7 came to represent something. So when Jesus provides this incredible miracle for the people who were there, and there are 7 baskets left over, it's a nod to the Jews who are hearing, to the Israelites in the first century who are hearing, to say, yep, there's more than enough for Israel, and there is also more than enough for the entire world. It's the location that tells the story as much as anything that Jesus does. There is no other reason to go over there. There is no other reason that the disciples should be over there, but that Jesus sees those people. He sees their need, and He says, I came for you, and I will keep coming back for you as long as it takes. That's why we need this story. Because some of us have lived on the other side. I think we might have said it every week in this series. Some of us live on the other side, and we wonder whether Jesus will make the journey. Over and over and over again, we see that Jesus will. That His love knows no bounds. What we see is that the solution, the antidote to a love-starved world, is God's love delivered through the actual body of Jesus, in the person of Christ. What we see is that God's abundant provision isn't just for us. It's for the other side too. Jesus sees the need, provides the solution, and sends the disciples out. So, brothers and sisters, there are love-starved people in this room. There are love-starved people in Peachtree City. And what I want to know is whether they're going to go home full or empty tonight. The answer, I think, depends on you. Will these people who hunger for love go home empty again? Or will we take what Jesus has given us and feed them? Feed their hearts and their souls and bring them home.